now that the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox have been released, their actual specs have been released to the public, and both of the companies have had a chance to speak with many journalists and talk about the unique architectures of their system. So this is pretty much basically a comparison of everything that has been released to the public in the media over the past couple of weeks. So let's start off by comparing the Xbox One CPU versus the PlayStation 4 CPU. So the Xbox One CPU is actually clocked higher. It's clocked at 1.75 gigahertz versus the PlayStation CPU, which is 1.6 gigahertz. And both of them are 8-core processors, obviously. But in real-world performance, the CPU on the Xbox One is actually 10% faster. But apart from that, the CPU also gets some of its pretty much audio processing offloaded to a much superior audio processing unit, which pretty much frees up CPU cycles. Unfortunately, the PlayStation 4 does not have that, so clearly the advantage here goes to the Xbox One. The GPU, on the other hand, is a different story. So the PlayStation 4 GPU has 18 compute units, and the Xbox One GPU actually has 12 compute units, but the Xbox One GPU, each of the units is actually 6% faster than the PlayStation 4's 18. And the PlayStation, at least according to Sony, is actually only bound to take advantage of 14 compute units. Now, there have been many discussions regarding so which one's better, like 12, each of which run at pretty much like 6% faster rate or having basically more. And Microsoft engineers say that it's actually better to have 12 compute units and increase their speed versus basically having more. And a slide pointed, pretty much a slide that Sony shared with the media exactly says that. So it says that basically the hardware is balanced at 14 compute units, but there are basically 4 additional ones stacked on. But if you use those 4 for rendering, it's pretty much like a minor boost, and it's basically just not recommended. So at the end of the day, I would say pretty much the GPU is actually quite balanced. Both of them pretty much probably have the same real-world performance, because one's faster and one's slower, but one obviously is only balanced to take advantage of 14 compute units, while the GPU on the Xbox One obviously doesn't have any problems because it just says 12. So, I'm not exactly sure, but at the end of the day, in my opinion, they pretty much balance each other out. And I think Digital Foundry actually did a comparison of pretty much two systems, one that had pretty much the same specs as Xbox One versus the PlayStation 4, and they found that the real-world performance with actually more compute units, if all of them ran at the same speed, was actually only 24%. So if you increase each compute unit's processing by 6%, it probably pretty much cancels each other out, or maybe even gives the Xbox One GPU an edge. I'm not really sure about this, but I guess eventually we'll let the games decide for themselves. Now comes the most, hotly debated topic. So which one is better? Is a combination of ESRAM and DDR3 RAM better versus just having pretty much GDDR5 RAM? So there's lots of debate about this. So GDDR5 RAM on paper offers around 175 GB per second bandwidth. 176 GB per second bandwidth. And the memory on the Xbox One, if you combine the ESRAM, which is, ridiculously fast compared to GDDR5, obviously there's no question about that. But it's also in very, very small chunks, and you have to program for it in a very unique way. It's obviously much faster. It's on paper, at least, it's 272 gigabytes per second. And apparently you can also read and write simultaneously. So now let's take a look at the real-world performance. So if you take a look at the real-world performance, obviously no system is 100% efficient, so 272 gigabytes per second, and 176 gigabytes per second only look good on paper. When you actually get into the real world and you lose pretty much energy and like stuff like in like heat and other whatchamacallit, well, heat mostly, the real world performance and the bandwidth actually decrease, because obviously no system is 100% efficient. And so the real world performance from both of these, I mean, I'm guessing the Xbox One is probably going to be like 150-ish. At least that's what the developers claim. And I have no idea what the real world performance of the PlayStation 4 memory will be, because no one has really talked about that. But I'm assuming it's probably the same, considering they're unified. But the thing to point out is that the Xbox One, the memory, the whole like move engines and the DDR3 and the ESRAM, it's pretty much like it's, I mean, obviously much more difficult to basically like code for that. I mean, I wouldn't say it's like supremely difficult, but it's mostly more annoying to code for that rather than just like throw everything at the GDDR5. Now we come to the odd thing that I actually read. So the bus speed at which the CPU and the GPU can communicate on the Xbox One is actually 30 gigabytes per second. And on the PlayStation 4 is actually 10 gigabytes per second. And that actually really surprised me. So according to Microsoft, the way the two communicate is actually 3 times more efficient than the PlayStation 4. And I'm not really sure how this is eventually going to maybe tip the scales in the favor of Xbox One or not, but that is something to consider. That in general, it's a more balanced system. So initially, when I read everything that was said, I thought the PlayStation 4 pretty much had the edge, but to be honest, now I'm not really sure. I mean, like the Xbox One has some like very unique architecture that pretty much, in my opinion, gives it an edge, but only if developers are pretty much going to put the time in to actually code for it. I mean, obviously, it's not going to take so much time, but if you think about multi-platform titles, I mean, what would you rather do? Just throw everything at one like pool of data, or use the, I guess, like the unique architecture of like a different system? And that's a reason I feel that some games, for example, like Call of Duty Ghost, run at 720p on the Xbox One versus 1080p on the PlayStation 4. But then again, I mean, lots of people are saying that the 720p Xbox One version actually doesn't have any performance issues like frame rate stutters, while the PlayStation 4 version actually does. At least that's according to Polygon and IGN and like a couple of other sources. So at the end of the day, to be honest, now I think the Xbox One has an edge. Maybe not in the short run, but definitely in the long run, considering its unique architecture and the way it pretty much balances memory out. But at the end of the day, comparisons like these are probably are left better to the people who actually make the devices. And the only thing we can say is we'll pretty much see what happens when the games come out. And a couple of years down the line, I guess we'll have a better idea of which system edges the other one out. But until then, I guess these comparisons are fun to make, and I hope this video helped you pretty much figure out what the actual specs for these devices are, and I don't know what to expect from the future.